the full name. So thank you for that, making the effort. And good evening, everybody. It's already been a fantastic day for me. I've enjoyed hearing all the presentations. I'm hoping that we have the steam and the energy to carry through and finish the day well. So, the last 20 years have seen Ghana emerge as a thriving digital hub in Africa. Africa's first artificial intelligence lab has just been launched in Accra by Google. And to the great chagrin of my Nigerian brethren, unfortunately Jessie is not here, so I can't rub it in her face, but there's been a great war because Twitter has chosen Ghana over Nigeria, as if there should even be a competition for its African headquarters. Anybody familiar with the Jollof Wars between Ghana and Nigeria will know that that is a particularly contentious issue. But Ghana is becoming important, digitally speaking. There's also, as we speak, the construction of a new digital village, which is supposed to be Africa's Silicon Valley. Quite innovatively, it's called Silicon Accra. And it's expected to be completed in the next year or so. A personal friend of mine actually is the CEO of that project. And so I'm fortunate to be able to speak to some of these developments in the digital space in Ghana because, like Matt said, before coming to New College to study theology, I did work as a country manager for Google's developer groups in Ghana, and so also worked as a software entrepreneur. In that time, one of the things that I noticed is something that has become increasingly well documented in especially social scientific scholarship, and that is the fact that young people in Ghana are spending more and more of their time online. This, on the surface, is not any different from what you might find in most of the rest of the world. But for a small country like Ghana, you know, it's 35 million people-ish. And I say ish because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the last census, which would have been in 2020, did not happen. You know, so these are estimated figures. It's a small country, geographically speaking, as well. You know, for such a small country to rank number 9 globally for time spent on social media says a lot about, you know, the kind of lifestyle that's being generated by mobile devices, especially among young people. So I noticed this happening. I also noticed that this was generating a lot of angst amongst religious authorities, because if you are familiar with any of the contemporary research around digital culture, one of the religious concerns with it is that it promotes individualization, which goes against a sense of community, which underpins a lot of ecclesiological theology. It promotes moral compromise and degeneracy. And so in Ghana, there are many debates transpiring online between young people who think that the church oversteps its boundaries in prescribing codes of conduct in online space. And church officials who have to find ways to appear on Facebook and make their case that, you know, besides using these technologies for the furtherance of the gospel, you know, for missiological aims and for evangelism. In fact, some of them have said outright, you shouldn't even be on social media. One of Ghana's most famous charismatic preachers, who actually styles himself the founder of the charismatic movement of West Africa, his name being Nicholas Duncan Williams, actually in a recent sermon said that social media is actually for old people, people who have lived their lives, achieved what, you know, God has called them to achieve, and have time to waste, or in their case, spend. But for any young person who should be thinking constructively about making a life and fashioning an existence, it's a complete waste of time to be on there. So this was sometime last year. In March this year, he did the pointing challenge, announcing this is my first TikTok. So he's now officially on TikTok. And I think that just shows you, you know, the power of new digital media when it comes to controlling the conversation around the ethics of public life, right? And just people's perceptions of who they are as persons. And the church's role in that conversation, the public's role in that conversation, is not only mediated by, but it's also very greatly exacerbated by the fact that we do not really understand what happens to people's subjectivities as they interact with each other and as they interact with established religious authorities online. So this is the big problem that my research is going to try and address. Unfortunately, even for the social sciences, where you have, the vast majority of literature in this subject emerging, like I said, these concepts are just not clearly understood. But we're still in theology. There is literally no theological discussion around these themes, even though, like I've said, it's in Ghana at least, because Ghana is 70% Christian, it's really a Christian religious response that you hear when discussions about the morality and the ethics of life online are being held. So I think that it's high time that a very careful, systematic theological inquiry into the whole situation is done, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So in very specific terms, my study is trying to interrogate the question of personhood, personal identity, taking the view that personal identity is not just something that is given, but also something that is constructed on a continuous basis. And if you take that perspective, if personal identity emerges as we interact with each other, because it is not only the individual as an individual, but the individual in relation, then you have to ask what happens when the medium and the means of relation is greatly altered. And I think you'd agree that transposing our day-to-day interaction onto online media really does affect the way conversation happens. It affects the way we present ourselves. It affects the way we see ourselves as well. And so I'm going to try and relate that dynamic, which, like I've said, is in the discourse at least mostly a sociological conversation with theological perspectives around agency and autonomy. When it comes to agency, the thing that is most disturbing for many religious authorities in Ghana is agency seems to promote autonomy. And autonomy means that the individual assumes a certain sense of freedom from church control. So that, for example, when in 2018, the Church of Pentecost in Ghana was accused of banning the posting of pictures advertising your wedding online. Right? Young people rallied and said, well, how dare the church ban us from telling our friends through Facebook, save the date, right? But the church's response is, the pictures young people use to announce their weddings are pictures that presuppose they are already married, right? The church was not pleased with the posture that intending couples were taking in these photographs. So that's just one instance, right, of how the ethics of the performance of self involved the church. So in that particular instance, the argument was that the agency of the young people was being tampered with, right? And does the church really have the authority to ban something like that? In fact, what mode of interaction should the church have with young people online? Because quite frankly, addressing this in a sermon in church would be a completely different specimen of communication than coming on Facebook and saying, from this day forth, nobody shall. Okay. So that's one instance of how agency and autonomy come in. And theologically, my research is going to try and relate this to the question of free will and how that is affected when we look at it through the lens of people's online agency and autonomy. And I will come to that in a second. When it comes to autonomy itself, the democratization of information that is promoted by digital culture also means that Young people are having to, for themselves, navigate what is theological truth online. Okay, so in time past, if a friend of yours made a claim different from what your denomination taught, you would probably go to a Bible study next Sunday, and maybe in Sunday school, or speaking with your pastor personally, you would ask him for clarification. Digital media means that these days people are looking to people who may not be necessarily theologically trained, but are seen as theologically competent. So the way people are navigating what is theologically true is changing online simply because information is being democratized. And there's an increase in theological blog writing, for example, and because there is no formal censorship or formal filtering, no qualifications necessary to start a blog on Johannine theology, for example, right? It's a free space, and so navigating what is plausible, navigating what is true becomes very, very complicated. And this is not just an academic question, it's important because it also goes to affect people's sense of belonging when it comes to denominational questions. It goes to affect people's sense of multiple belonging as well. Very increasingly, young people will not tell you specifically that I am Presbyterian. They are more inclined to say that they are Christian, or perhaps in using broader umbrella terms, they might say they are charismatic or they are Pentecostal. And so this is also posing a problem for existing religious, authority figures who feel as if the grip of the church is being lost when it comes to playing an active role in shaping individuality and self-identity. Now, I have to say that the way I'm coming to this research is a little bit complicated. It's a little bit complicated because whereas I could simply take very ancient texts, and I will at some point talk about that, and discuss in very theoretical ways free will and basically theological anthropology of the individual person, and see how that is filtered through the digital lens. I'm trying to approach this in a way that is relevant to the lived experience, okay? And I'm trying to see what are the ways in which people represent themselves, represent their identity and their personhood online. And one of the most glaring instances of that, at least in terms of Ghanaian online discourse, is seen in gender discourses, right? Gender relations. The differences between the way the church portrays how a man should be and how a woman should be are every day challenged very, very strongly online, right? So you have a spate of new feminist digital activist movements, one of them called Pepe Them Ministries. They've called themselves that because in Ghana, Pepe is a sign, I'm sure, universally of pain, right? The whole metaphor is to pepper their eyes with the truth, right? They see themselves as challenging what they call toxic narratives from the pulpits. So you can see that the war over the identity of the modern woman, right, is in the first instance is expressed in religious terms, but in the second instance it's not so much transpiring in church as it is on Facebook and on Twitter. And it's transpiring not only in direct responses of women to the church through their activism, but it's also transpiring in everyday self-representation, the way people post on Instagram visually, as well as what they write on Twitter and Facebook. And so I'm going to try and use this as a sort of ethnographic window to enter the discussion on how personhood is portrayed and how it's being understood in recent times. So that has to be stated as the first limitation of the project. And I should clarify that while I am doing this with gender, this is primarily a study on personhood as theologically understood, and taking the assumption that digital culture is seriously affecting it and changing it, not per se a gender studies study. Another thing I should mention is that my study is going to be very specifically concerned with personhood, not selfhood, or self-identity or individuality, which are also very similar terms that are used in the scholarship, but these have various connotations of meaning on their own. And I'm looking at personhood because I'm trying to deal both with the individual as a single individual, which would mirror the atomistic view of individuality that's common in Western conceptions, but also the relational aspect of the person, the community engaging aspect of the person. So this is why I'm focusing on personhood as against those terms. So to sort of crystallize this in a simple statement that hopefully we can all relate to, the question that I'm posing is, how do Ghanaian youth negotiate their construction and portrayal of personal identity and Christian faith within digital culture? And I've broken that down into 3 sub-questions. And the first one, how do Ghanaian youth use digital technologies for self-representation? And how does this affect their relationship with Christian institutional authority? Secondly, how can a theological conception of personhood as a constantly created existence illuminate the youth's quest for authentic personhood and online self-representation? And thirdly, how does this quest challenge African communitarianism as a basis for theological understandings of personhood? In approaching these questions, I'm adopting an ethnographic approach in which I will speak to some of these digital activists, find out what their vision of themselves are and what their projected vision of gender and gender relations are. I will also be looking at identity-related sermons and seminars and presentations by some of Ghana's most influential Christian speakers to try and profile the ecclesial projection of personhood and compare that with how young people see themselves and are trying to portray themselves, and determine whether there is actually a variance and what the nature of that variance might be. Because I think it's in that space that public theology can make a contribution to harmonizing the visions and making sure that instead of the frequent rancorous debates and contentions between the younger and older generations in Ghanaian Christianity, there's more of a dialogue that's upbuilding and that preserves human dignity and flourishing. I'm very mindful of my own positionality as a man in coming to these studies. So, in being mindful of that, I'm aware that being an outsider gender-wise means that I must be more attuned to not only the differences, but also respectful of the values and the positions and the life experiences from which people are coming and from which their positions are being taken. So just to say that I'm aware of that, and we'll probably have to come up with more intricate ways to ensure that ethnography is not unduly compromised because of that. So I'm looking at Emma, who has graciously been guiding me through that process already. So to just run off on the theological discussion that I hope to undertake, based on these ethnographic studies. My aim is to construct a theological framework of personhood as informed, though not wholly determined by digital culture, within which digital autonomy and Christian community can be productively bridged. For this, I draw on, and this is where the ancient theological literature comes in. I draw on 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard, together with Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gyekye, contemporary Ghanaian philosopher, and there are reasons why I've chosen these two to mediate the conversation on personhood in a digital context that they did not share, or that at least Kierkegaard did not share. Kierkegaard, who is regarded by many as the father of existentialism, offers an individual-oriented investigation of authentic Christian personhood through his works Either Or and Fear and Trembling, which are the 2 main works that I'll be drawing on. Kwame Gyekye offers a theory he calls moderate communitarianism, where he says within African scholarship, there is too much of an insistence on the individual as a product of society. He says that it is not correct to assume that the society always should take precedence over the individual. But he also warns that we should not lapse into what is a traditional Western approach of highlighting the individual over and above the society. He says that a more productive way to look at it is that both are mutually generated. And in that mutual generation, dialogue ensures that communitarianism does not breed tyranny, and hyper-individualism does not breed licentiousness and utmost relativism. So while Kierkegaard belongs to a very different time period, his work addresses how authentic Christian personhood, which he calls the single individual, is to be fashioned in the midst of social transformations wrought by wide-scale adoption of communication technologies and media, which for him would have been the telegraph, the railroad, the emergence of newspapers. He saw the media as producing the public, and the public contained the untruth of the crowd, and it caused people to be conformists and made them lazy Christians because people are not self-reflective. Kierkegaard hated the media and the public that it created. He saw this as a disturbing creation, and that was inimical to true selfhood because it breeds superficiality and uncritical conformity. And one must resist its leveling influence, the untruth of the crowd, to emerge as a true, authentic individual or Christian. Thus, Kierkegaard sees Christian personhood not as a given quality of being, but as a goal to be constantly striven for through an intentional walk of faith. This concept of personhood as a telos, as a destination rather than as a given, is central to not only his work, but also to mine, because the underlying assumption is that digital culture enables a new way of fashioning the self, rather than accepting yourself as you are. So as I said, many traditional older church leaders see digital media as promoting the exact opposite. For Kierkegaard, the Christian must be self-reflective. The Christian must be in charge and in control of the process of becoming a Christian. But digital media are accused of fostering exactly the opposites, exposing the youth to consumerist culture, to relativism, and to a hyper sense of their own individualism that does not allow the church enough space to help fashion their personhood. So I'm going to be engaging in a constructive dialogue between the two to try and find out how exactly public theology can approach the distance between those two conceptions. Of course, Jechi would agree that the movement from the aesthetic person, which is for Kierkegaard, the aesthetic person is the individual starts out as concerned only with themselves, but the individual then moves to an appreciation that there is actually a community that they must ethically relate to. And then from there, the individual becomes a religious person. These are the movements Kierkegaard believes that the authentic Christian makes. And you are not an authentic Christian until you have moved from being an aesthete to a religious person. Jechi would agree that this is necessary, but he would caution that digital technologies perhaps make it more difficult for this movement to happen than they facilitate it. And so as a first study to theologically probe personhood from a Ghanaian contextual perspective, my research will help to fill a double lacuna. First, the paucity globally of theological scholarship on digital culture, and the scarcity of African theological theorizing on personhood. By doing so, it will offer a contextual contribution to the renewed theological interest in personhood and provide a contextual framework for public theological engagement in an increasingly digitized public sphere. Furthermore, it provides a basis for expanding the liberational aims of African theology by attuning it to the socio-ethical affordances of digital media and their inherent capacities for exclusion, oppression, and digital colonialism.